I'm happy to see that all you guys actually showed up, even though you guys like came in like like running out of breath. What we're going to be talking about today, before we get to the tournament, because as I said, there's always going to be a part where we actually discuss the history or learn something about games. We're going to be talking about the Nintendo 64. And the best way to understand where the Nintendo 64 comes from is to understand what was happening right before it, and that is the beginning of a huge competition between Nintendo and Sony. Now, in the early 90s, CD-based technology was a new thing, and it was a very hot thing. I mean, basically, it could hold more information, and it was a lot cheaper to produce. Essentially, a CD is a piece of plastic with a sticker on top of it. So, I mean, it was a lot easier to produce than a cassette, or a VHS, or a cartridge. Some systems had already started to use CD-based technologies. For instance, the infamous Sega CD, which ended up flopping, which was also produced by Sony. Oh, look, he's clicking on it. So the Sega CD was the first like big one that came out, and basically, and then
yeah, Jurassic Park on the Sega CD is awesome.
Yeah, so was Alien vs. Predator.
Oh yeah.
So, jeez, it's huge, dude.
Yeah.
I gotta stop looking. I'm getting distracted. I know, it's frightening. That's what he's doing because he knows I'm a Nintendo fan. He knows he's going to come get me. Okay, anyways, let's get back to the whole story here. So Nintendo wanted a piece of this whole CD-based technology, and so they thought that they'd go to the same people who made the Sega CD, which was actually Sony. Sony was really big in technology at the time. I think their first real big success was the Walkman. I'm not mistaken. That thing was pretty sweet. I had one, walked around with it, thought it was cool. Anyway, so they started to do this partnership with them. And they just decided they were going to make a CD attachment for the Super Nintendo, and so Sony got really excited and started to work on it. And this is where everything starts to get really messed up. Basically, Nintendo caught wind that Sony had plans to make their own video game system, and started to get kind of worried. They thought about the fact that Sony already knew all the inner workings of Sega's technology. And then Sony's going to know all the inner workings of Nintendo's technology, and then they're going to take all that information and make a system of their own. It's like teaching somebody to shoot a gun if you can guarantee that later on they're going to shoot you with a gun. I mean, it's suicide. It's insane to do. But the thing that's messed up is they didn't really inform Sony that they knew that Sony was going to make a system. And it all came down at the, let's see, what is it, Consumer Electronics Show, I think it is, in 1992. Basically, Sony stood up on the first day, very, very proud of themselves, and declared that they were going to be making a CD attachment for Nintendo. Oh my God, what a huge thing that would be. Nintendo, the god of video games, partnering with Sony, the god of technology. I mean, putting these two together was going to be amazing. Everyone got so excited, and then the next day, Nintendo stands up and says, I don't know what the hell Sony's talking about, because we're partnering with Philips, and we're making our CD-based technology from Philips. So suddenly there's Sony left with egg on their face, like, why didn't you tell me this? You know, and this is where the huge rivalry between the two start. Now, as everybody who has studied video game history knows, the whole thing with Super Nintendo having a CD attachment, that never really came to be, and Philips ended up making the CDI, which was a commercial and, in my opinion, a complete failure, period. It was pretty terrible. And then Sony started making the PlayStation. Now, the PlayStation, when it came out, was a CD-based technology, and it came out one solid year before the Nintendo 64, which means that when the Nintendo 64 came out, not only did Sony have a whole assortment of great titles such as Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Twisted Metal, they had already started working on sequels to these amazing titles. And so there's Nintendo just coming out, and Sony's already got leaps and bounds ahead of them, and even worse, the Sony machine could play CDs. So it also served as a CD player and a video game player. So, and that's what Sony's always done, is they make these like dual machines. Now, Nintendo chose to do a cartridge-based system for two basic reasons. The first reason is just because cartridges are safer, and they are harder to damage, and also no loading times. The biggest problem with CD-based technology when it first starts, which any of you guys who ever had a PlayStation, is that you sit there loading forever. I oftentimes will blame the Sony PlayStation for the reason why I bite my nails today, is because while it was loading, I had nothing to do, so I would just start gnawing at myself. But the dorky little bit of information. But, yo?
Can I say something?
Go for it, brother.
I just remember playing a Tomb Raider on there. Each time, like, I just couldn't get past this one little point. Each time I just fall down the hole, and then, like, 2 more minutes of loading screen. I'm like...
It was ridiculous. Well, I was actually describing the way a fight game worked on a PlayStation, because you'd have to load the start screen, and then you'd have to load the character roster, and then when you chose your characters, it had to load your characters, and then it had to load the background, and then you do one fight, and then it have to load again. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. So that was one reason why they chose to have a cartridge-based system. But more importantly, the reason why they chose a cartridge-based system for the Nintendo 64 is at the time, it was way too easy to pirate CD-based technology. It had absolutely no protection for CDs, and Sony, they were okay because they just decided they were going to flood the market with games. Nintendo's never been that way. Nintendo's always done more quality versus quantity. They come out with one really good game a year as opposed to a handful of okay games. And they just didn't want people pirating their games, so they decided to be a cartridge. Now, what happened between these two? Well, as anybody knows, the real thing is Sony won. Sony won this first little bout, hands down. I mean, it demolished it. But Nintendo was actually doing very well. If you think about some of the games for Nintendo, they pretty much wrote the rule for 3D gaming. If you take Mario 64, that wrote the book on 3D platforming. You take Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, wrote the book on 3D adventure games. And then you take a game like 007 GoldenEye, a third-party game, which for starters proved that you can have excellent third-party games, but also wrote the book on first-person shooters for the time. So Nintendo was doing great, but what happened that really broke Nintendo down was Final Fantasy. Square has always went to Nintendo to make their Final Fantasy games. From the get-go, the first Nintendo and the Super Nintendo always had their Final Fantasy games. We got werewolf again. It's the Final Fantasy games. And so, actually, Square told Nintendo that they were going to make another Final Fantasy for the Nintendo 64. So, everyone was pretty excited about that. Nintendo was like, this is going to be it. This is going to be the thing that we can rise above and crush everybody. And the next thing you know, Final Fantasy VII, one of the most influential games in history, essentially solidified the RPG market in the United States, comes out as a PlayStation exclusive. Payback. I know. And it demolishes Nintendo, and Nintendo couldn't stand up from that point on, and Nintendo just fell off, and they just completely felt betrayed by everybody, but they did that too. I guess, you kind of reap what you sow. And as we know, we all know the rest of the story because all of you guys are old enough to live it. The next round happened, GameCube versus PlayStation 2. Don't even kid me. GameCube got its butt whooped, and then currently Wii is the dominant system in the market. Because it just had Xbox.
We're talking about consumer market reports, my friend.
Yeah.
The Wii is God right now.
I'm talking about quality of game. I'm not talking
Playability?
about how many consoles you sold.
But that's how they look at it.
You can make whatever argument you want. Console wars are not a matter of opinion, they're a matter of numbers. And right now, Nintendo is winning.
Okay, how many
Nintendo's not.
14-year-olds get their parents to buy them either the cheapest system on the market?
That's because it's good marketing.
Exactly.
I'm not even saying what's a good system, what's a bad system. I mean, plenty of people can argue that the original Xbox was better than the PlayStation 2. I mean, it surely was more powerful, but PlayStation 2 still whooped the original Xbox financially. And so that's basically how we came to understanding how the Nintendo 64 came to be. Now, don't ever count it out as a failed system. It actually was a very successful system. I think it sold like 32 million units in the United States, I think it was. And also it made plenty of revolutions. The Nintendo 64 has the first analog control. It also has the first shoulder trigger button And so both those concepts come from Nintendo, and they did a lot of other wacky things with Nintendo, like the 2 different ways to hold the controller. But probably my favorite thing Nintendo brought to everybody was force feedback. They had the first Rumble Pack. It was this big pack you put in the bottom of your controller, and it shook your controller whenever you got hit. Anybody who played with it knows that you also heard it because it would be like, because it would spin. But it was what brought it forward. What's that, brother?
Actually, the original Rumble Packs, they were marketed, they actually came with Star Fox 64.
They did come with
as
Star
a
Fox
combo
64.
expansion pack. And
Yeah. So while you were saving Slippy, you also had to hear. So that's a basic rundown of the history of the Nintendo and exactly where it was in the market. It was a number 2 system. It was the first number 2 system for Nintendo. Also keep in mind, at this time, Nintendo was still whooping some butt when it came to their handheld, the Game Boy, which is one of the best-selling consoles ever.